endlessly searching for an original sin.
Then he walked out of the convenience store and into the stillness of the night. Yuji had started working there part-time as a means to cover his living expenses. Usually, he would head over right after school, then work until about 10 o'clock at night. The manager, while a little overbearing at times, had always been considerate of Yuji's condition. No matter how many times Yuji called in sick, he always let it slide. Yuji was quite grateful for this, so he decided to keep working there until he graduated from academy. With his shift now over for the night, Yuji headed home. Thankfully, his house was only 15 minutes away on foot. In this predominantly residential neighborhood, hardly anyone went out at night, save for the occasional car. Yuji was all alone. The dim, flickering light of the street lamps only served to emphasize the emptiness around him. After so many nights deprived of sleep, Yuji was ready to drop. Yet he knew that the moment he crawled into bed, his eyes would snap wide awake. There was no escape from the misery. His shoes tapped softly on the well-worn pavement as he passed slowly beneath the lights. Suddenly, through the haze of drowsiness, he sensed a presence behind him. He couldn't hear their footsteps, but they were there. He was certain of it. Deserted though the neighborhood typically was, it wouldn't be the first time he'd run into someone else at night. With that thought bolstering his courage, he looked casually over his shoulder. By the way, since I'm not feeling that great tonight, I will do another stream probably on Thursday if it's good for everybody, or Sunday during the day. It's up to you guys. And we'll do some Sweet Dreams Succubus to make up for me not being able to do it after this. But no one was there. All that lay behind him was a sprawling darkness of night. He was so sure he'd felt someone's presence. Had it been his imagination? Perhaps the lack of sleep was making him hallucinate. Thursday's good? Alright, perfect. If everyone else says that it's good, then I will make the announcement after the stream on the places that it's going to be on Thursday. And I'll do an extra long one. Sunday's better? Alright, if Sunday is better, then just let me know. I'll make the announcement and I'll ask everybody. Sometimes, when he could barely keep his eyes open, it was easy to mistake shadows or patterns for monsters. Maybe that was all that had been. But then why did he feel so cold? Had he fallen ill? Was this yet another symptom of his sleep deprivation? Then I'll probably make it Sunday morning or afternoon. His drowsy haze began to clear away. He quickened his pace, eager to get home. Then he sensed the presence again. Not just one. There were several this time. He shot another glance over his shoulder, but once again, no one was there. Even with the street lamps, the road behind him was dark, stretching into the endless abyss of night. Paranoia seized him, and he doubled his pace. Behind him, he heard the rustling noise, like dead leaves being crunched underfoot. But there was no trees on this road. And then he heard something else. Something that made his skin crawl. Crawling. Nope. A wet, wiggling sound like raw meat being stirred in a pan. It was too much. Yuji burst into a run. It wasn't his imagination. Someone, no, something was back there, chasing him. The street lamps only made it worse. Under the light of the darkness felt all the more menacing. Whatever it was, he had to escape. If it caught him, he didn't stop running until he was home. The second he made it inside, he shut and lock the door behind him. Gasping for breath, he went to the kitchen sink, poured himself a glass of tap water, and gulped it down. Wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, he returned the glass to the counter. What was that just now? Was he sure that he hadn't imagined it? No, he'd felt it. And that sound, the memory sent a shiver down his spine. Something had been chasing him. He recalled the sound of the wet, raspy breath. It seemed so real. What happened was I clicked on the chat and I think I accidentally clicked your name. So that's why I wanted to make sure. But at the same time, he knew that it couldn't be. His heart still thumping wildly in his ears, Yuji headed for his bedroom. He remembered the ghost story Makoto had recounted earlier that day. He hadn't believed it, of course. He wasn't that gullible, but he'd still felt a little on the edge afterwards. Perhaps the story had gotten to him after all. People said that telling ghost stories was a good way to get yourself haunted for real. Surely that wasn't true, right? It was probably the fatigue. Maybe a bath would help clear his mind. With that thought, he grabbed a change of clothes and headed to the bathroom. He was normally more of a shower person, but tonight he was in the mood for a long soak. His sister was the one who had turned him on to the stress-relieving powers of a nice, hot bath. After pausing by the sink to strip down, Yuji turned on the hot water. Soon steam was rising from the tub. It clung to his bare skin. As he waited for the tub to fill, he glanced at the mirror. Through the steam, he could make out the dark, raised scar on the left side of his chest. It was a vestige of a childhood injury, from the same accident that had claimed his parents' lives. Even after all these years, the sight of it still pained him. Turning away from the mirror, he quickly rinsed himself down with the shower head, then stepped into the tub. Instantly, he felt the warmth of the water seep into his feet. Slowly, he lowered himself into the bath, submerging himself all the way up to his shoulders and letting the warmth envelop his whole entire body. Pushing his wet hair out of his face, he looked up to the ceiling and watched the steam rise around him as he reflected on the day's events. It wasn't long before his thoughts hit a brick wall. A wall named Tetsuo. That afternoon, Yuji and Tetsuo had been on trash duty together. Aside from the incident with the to-go meal, everything had gone as smoothly as could expected. But then, as Yuji was tying up the trash bag, something had touched him from behind. He put his hand on his neck. Why had Tetsuo touched him there? Just then he felt something strange on his neck, something slimy and slippery. Obviously, he expected his body to be wet, but this was different. He pulled his hand away from his neck and looked at his fingers. His breath caught in his throat. A red, viscous substance clung to his fingertips. Blood. The memory of that touch flashed through his mind again. He'd been wondering why Tetsuo had touched him out of the blue like that. Could it be? Had Tetsuo seen the blood? His mind reeled, his pulse quickened. As his breathing grew ragged, a tingling sensation spread through his hands and feet. Perhaps he'd been soaking for too long, but just as he started to rise, he froze. The water was red. The water was red, blood red. Huh? His body was burning hot. He squeezed his eyes shut, unwilling to believe what he was seeing. Alright, guys. It's time to choose. Do you want to go with red or do you want to go with blue? Which shall we go with, everyone? Blue, blue. Okay. Looks like blue is winning. So we'll go with blue. One day I want to do another run of this of just red. No. Pushing the thought away, he opened his eyes. The sea of red had vanished. Everything was back to normal. Had it been just a trick of the light, a glitch in his sleep-deprived mind? Unable to think straight, Yuji climbed out of the tub. But the instant he stepped onto the tile, his vision dimmed and he lost his balance, collapsing against the wall. Stumbling out of the bathroom on unsteady legs, Yuji grabbed his towel and dried himself off. Why had the bath water looked so red? Was he sure that it hadn't been real? It couldn't have. Timidly, he peered back through the bathroom door. Sure enough, the water was clear. All in all, it had been a long and exceptionally bizarre day. Clearly, he was just really tired. Yuji stepped back inside and pulled the plug to let the water drain. Then he put on his pajamas and went back to his room. After feeding the fish, he lay down on the bed, his hair still damp. But despite his exhaustion, he couldn't quite fall asleep. His brain was still struggling to process everything that had happened. In the end, Yuji wound up staring at the ceiling until the morning light filtered through the window. Meanwhile, that night, as the rest of the city was heading to bed, the Okinaga household was settling in for a late dinner.
ご飯まだ
An impatient voice called from the dining room.
ご飯遅いよね。ねえ、クリスティン。
Xenia sat alone at the large empty table, pouting and stroking the fat green iguana perched on his shoulder.
もう少し待っていてください。
From the kitchen, Kitani replied cordially, a frying pan in one hand. That was the sexiest thing I've seen in this game yet. Xenia lived on the plain, white, two-story house, about 20 minutes from school by car. It was an unpretentious dwelling, modestly decorated with simple, functional furniture. The interior was well maintained, with not a single scratch on the perfectly polished floors. He had Kitani to thank for that.
お待たせしました。
Moving to the table, Kitani set a plate in front of the younger man. It was piled high with eggplant stir-fry, and Xenia raised his hands jubilantly.
待ったよ。お腹すいた。
どうぞ召し上がれ。
Kitani smiled warmly, placing a bowl of miso soup beside the plate. Soon the table was filled with several different salads, a batch of white rice, and a few other dishes.
いただきます。
Xenia grabbed his chopsticks and started eating. Kitani took off his apron and sat down across from him. But he didn't serve himself a plate. Instead, as the household's caretaker, he waited for Xenia to eat his fill. This, he had decided, was where he belonged in life. Ever since Xenia's father, Okinaga Kunihito, had found Kitani on the street and brought him into the family. At the time, Kunihito had been the boss of the Okinaga Gumi, a gang associated with the major crime syndicate known as the Seiryu Kai. In its prime, the Okinaga Gumi had boasted nearly 100 members, and Kitani had been its top lieutenant, a position he'd earned in the years since his boss had lifted him from poverty. He owed his boss everything. When Kunihito, deteriorating mental health, had forced him into retirement, Kitani had elected to stay by his side. Now they lived off Kunihito's remaining assets, plus revenue from properties he had inherited from his uncle. It was less exciting life, but Kitani didn't care. The gang meant nothing without Kunihito. Kitani's place was here, serving the Okinaga family. Housework was no trouble. He'd been doing it since he was a kid. He'd even learned to enjoy devising new recipes for dinner. Dude, I found my man. He cooks and cleans. I'm just saying. And he looks like he can throw a dude.
北に、これうまい。
Xenia speared a slice of fried eggplant on his chopstick and held it up, his mouth full of food.
行儀が悪いですよ、坊ちゃん。
いいんだよ。別にいいの。はーい。クリスティにはしそ
The iguana was leaning forward off his shoulder, looking very interested in her own owner's food. Xenia picked a shiso leaf out of the salad and held it up to her. Christy opened her mouth wide and snapped the leaf up. Well, at least he's a good owner.
おいしいね。
He's a good owner. Look at him feeding his little iguana.
まったく。
Kitani sighed, smiling in spite of himself. Xenia could be so innocent when he was in a good mood. It warmed his heart to see.
ご飯おかわりはいりますか？
半分だけね。
Kitani had taken Xenia's empty bowl and was about to pop open a rice cooker when all of a sudden a low, hoarse voice echoed through the dining room. Instantly, Xenia's smile vanished. Kitani should have been used to this by now, but he braced himself anyway. The owner of the voice was standing in the doorway. Okinaga Kunihito, Xenia's father, and the man who saved Kitani's life. His large frame and well-lined brow gave off a commanding air. He looked every inch the leader he had been. Until you saw his eyes. His eyes were bulging with fear, like a mouse hiding from a cat. This was a marked change from the old Kunihito. Those who'd known him back then would scarcely recognize him now.
帰ってきてからちゃんと祈りは捧げたのか?
He spoke in a scolding tone, one hand on the wall. Then, just as he was about to step into the dining room... What? Kunihito let out a shriek and shrank down, shielding his head with his arms. The plate Xenia had thrown at the wall fell to the floor in pieces. Dude, what the fuck? The younger Okinaga stared at his father for a moment, then stood up from his chair.
お腹いっぱい。
He stretched, patted Christy, and then left the table as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, Kunihito had curled up in a ball, flinched as Xenia passed by. The boy didn't give him a passing glance.
坊ちゃん
Kitani called out to him, but he didn't look back. Instead, he stopped in the hallway and stared into space, like a wolf picking up its ears.
今、動いた。
ん
Without another word, Xenia headed upstairs. Zitani sighed. This was becoming a regular occurrence. Xenia despised his father and would lash out at him every time they crossed paths. As someone who cared deeply for them both, Kitani found the whole situation frustrating. Okay, that's it. We get him out of here. We save the guy. He doesn't deserve this shit. Kunihito, not the father. Kunihito was still in the fetal position, trembling like an abused child. He flinched as Katani laid a hand on his shoulder.
立てますか。
Taking his arm, Katani helped Kunihito to his feet. The older man continued to glance around restlessly, as if searching for an invisible enemy.
あいつはどうした？ゼンはどこへ行った？
お部屋へ戻られましたよ。
祈りを捧げないからだ。だからあんな。
Really quick, I'm pretty sure the father's voice, I've heard him in other visual novels or a couple of animes. Clinging to Katani's shoulder, Kunihito shot a desperate glare down the hallway. Katani gently rubbed his back, hoping to calm him down.
後で伝えておきます。お部屋に戻りましょうか。薬も飲まなければ。水を持っていきますから。
祈りを。さもなくは怒りが。
Evidently, this lucid interval was over. Katani guided his master down the hall, stroking his back all the while.
どうか怒りをお鎮めください。怒りを。
Led by his right-hand man, the once feared gangster devolved into an incoherent babbling. His screams echoed impotently off the white walls. Oh, poor guy. The next day, Yuji headed to school, his mind still fuzzy from the lack of sleep. He hadn't gotten much rest that night before. Every time he'd closed his eyes, he'd thought about that blood-red bath water and the creepy sound he'd heard on the walk home. By the time he'd finally fallen asleep, it was light out. Unsurprisingly, when the alarm had woken him up a few hours later, he'd felt like garbage. I know that feeling. Thankfully, he'd managed to survive his morning classes and get through lunch. Now we just had to make it through the afternoon.
さあ、授業を始めるぞ。
Sorry, give me a second. I'm gonna take one or two. The religious studies teacher walked in right as the bell rang, signaling the start of the 5th period. Oh, it's okay. This is the Japanese voices. They usually actually do get a lot of really big name, like voice actors and stuff. During class, each student took turns reading from the Bible, as they were called on, but Yuji was having trouble following along. He tried to focus, but the words wouldn't stick in his brain. Oh, I feel like I'm gonna throw up. Sorry. It didn't help that he was already behind in class. No matter how hard he tried to concentrate, he kept zoning out.
つまり、キリスト教には三大宗派と呼ばれる教派がある。他にも様々な教派があって、これらは異端と呼ばれることもあるが、聖書の解釈が少しずつ異なることで分派していったというわけだな。
The teacher set down his chalk, dusted his hands off, and moved in front of the lectern? The lectern?
明治期以降、この辺りにも異端と呼ばれる大きな教派が生まれたそうだ。これはカルト的なもので、後に糾弾されて事実上解散したそうだがな。まあ、日本人は宗教的観念が薄い民族だと言われているが、みんなはどうだ？神を信じるか？
Oh, it's a podium. Okay. This question was met with hesitation and hushed giggles. A perfectly normal reaction. The students simply weren't that pious.
これは先生の個人的な意見だが、信仰を強要することは全くの無意味だと思ってる。信じる人間もいれば、信じない人間もいる。人の数だけ心があるからな。十人十色だ。すべての人間に信仰心を与えるような宗教なんかあるわけがない。 一人一人が自然と神を信じるようになった時、その時こそ信仰の始まりだと思ってる。神は信じる者も信じない者も皆平等に見ていてくださる。意識しなくてもみんなの心の中にいるんだ。
Okay, I'm gonna say this. I actually like that, the way he's putting it. Like, whether you're religious or not religious, it doesn't matter. That, you know, God watches over everybody. I kind of wish more religious people thought like that. Because I do know a couple religious people that get really mad if you say you're not religious. And they're like, oh, you know, God, if you don't believe in God, God doesn't believe in you, blah, 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 blah. I kind of wish more thought like this. I actually kind of like that. The students looked on dubiously as the teacher finished his sermon. Meanwhile, Yuji's mind began to wander. He asked himself, does God truly exist? Maybe. He couldn't say one way or the other. Either way, it didn't really matter to him. If believing in God helped other people feel better, he wouldn't try to stop them. Perhaps the question of whether God was real wasn't all that important to begin with. Did thinking like this make him a non-believer? This was all way over his head. Anyway, he had a feeling his outlook was fairly common. The Creator, regardless of name, watches us all. Yep, I believe that. I'm not going to say if I'm religious or if I'm not religious. I like the way that this game actually put that, and I kind of wish more thought like that. At least he was pretty sure most classes would agree with him. I kind of agree. I kind of think if you're a good person, then it really doesn't matter if you believe or not. Like I said, it only matters if you're a good person and you're willing to help people out and stuff. Because I've seen plenty of people who say they believe and they're not exactly the nicest of people, if you know what I mean. His gaze wandered around the room and landed on Tetsuo. What about him? Would he answer if asked about God? Wait, why was he speculating about Tetsuo of all people? He needed to concentrate on the lesson. It's deeds over words. Exactly, Don. Returning his gaze to his Bible, he spent the rest of the 5th period pretending to read along. I'd be asleep, I'm not gonna lie. I'm gonna go a little longer than I'm probably gonna leave because I'm still feeling really sick. Try as he might, Yuji wasn't able to focus on any of his classes that day. As soon as the bell rang, he made his way through the milling students to the garbage bins at the front of the room. He just wanted to get tragedy over with so that he could go home and sleep. As he began to sift through the burnables, he heard the rattle of the wallet chain and sensed someone standing right next to him. It was Tetsuo. A spark of anxiety shot through him, but he forced himself to stay calm as he continued his work. He heard Tetsuo rustling around the non-burnable garbage for a while. Then suddenly the sound stopped. Tetsuo, now talking to him, was now talking to him. Suppressing the urge to panic, Yuji looked over to find him, holding a plastic bag from the convenience store. He could make out the leftovers of a to-go meal inside. No, leftovers wasn't the right word. It was practically unopened. Once again, the culprit was Yuji himself. He received another free-to-go meal from work, but had felt too sick to eat it. Loath as he was to waste food, he had no choice but to toss it.
Oops,
I didn't even do that. Wrecked with guilt, Yuji mumbled a vague reply. Tetsuo narrowed his eyes. He couldn't bring himself to meet Tetsuo's piercing gaze. Turning back to the garbage can, Yuji sped through the rest of his work. He had avoided eye contact at all costs. Something told him that one look was all Tetsuo would need to see into his soul. Discomfort slowly built in his chest. By the time he had finished checking the trash, he could hardly breathe. Welcome to a panic attack. Unable to bear it a second longer, He pulled the bag out of the bin, tied it up, and hurried out of the classroom. As he left the main building, Yuji heaved a sigh of relief. All at once, the tension drained from his body. He just couldn't handle being around Tetsuo. The man was so intimidating. Even now, all the way out behind the school, he could still feel Tetsuo's eyes on him somehow. That piercing gaze boring into the back of his head. Excuse me. All of a sudden, he recalled Tetsuo touching his neck. Unconsciously, he traced the spot with his fingers to evoke the memory of the crimson bath water. He had seen blood on his fingers last night in the bath. He had hallucinated that part too. Why had Tetsuo touched him yesterday? Had he just been messing around? Or had he seen something that had sparked his curiosity? After riding this train of thought in circles for a while, Yuji gave up. No amount of speculation was going to give him the answer. The fastest way would be to ask Tetsuo directly, of course, but he had no idea how to do that. It wasn't the kind of topic one broached casually. As he contemplated this, the twin dumpsters came into view. After stuffing the bags of burnables into the proper containers, Yuji turned and walked away. I'm afraid tonight. Damn it! I'm sorry. I'm afraid tonight. Buttons. How do buttons work? Tonight I'm gonna have to call it. Like I said, I'm not feeling so hot. We'll do more of this and sweet succubus and all that on Sunday. I'll make the announcement about it. So I will see you guys next time. Once again, I'm really sorry about this. And for now, goodbye, guys.
Good night. Good night. Good night.